check.
What's up everyone, my name is Triplet and welcome to Game Off. I am recording this on July the 10th, so there's a long time between when this is recorded and when this is going to release because of scheduling and vacation and all that kind of stuff. So I might be talking about some changes that I'm making to Game Off and the scoring system that you may have already seen at this point, but I haven't written those yet. I haven't really recorded those. I know what I'm going to do, but I haven't really gotten into those, so I apologize if I sound like a broken record. But yeah, anyways, by the time this thing comes out, I will have had 4 games, 1 franchise, and 1 character out. So that's pretty awesome. That's 6 episodes, and in the second episode, we're gonna explore those other things further. We're gonna explore games, franchises, and characters further. But first, we're dipping our feet into the first ever Game Off for the greatest developer of all time. And you know what? I think the formula here should be a little bit different. It shouldn't just be my ideas. I think we need the critics and the fans to weigh in just as heavily. So let's talk about how that's gonna work. So I'm going to be splitting the points in half, with 50 points being based on fans and critics, and 50 points determined by me. The first 50 points will be straight up Metacritic scores, both critic and user scores, and while Metacritic scores aren't perfect in the grand scheme of things, they're pretty indicative of what people think of a game, and I mean, it's a flawed system for every game, so if it's shit, it's at least equally shit, instead of like, some is only sort of shit, and others are like super shitty shit, you know what I mean? Yeah, you know what I mean. Anyways, this will take into account all games created by the developer, so consistency is key here. You can have fantastic games, but if it's sprinkled in with those shitty shits we were talking about earlier, tough luck. Averaging these Metacritic scores will give us a score out of 100, so we'll just cut that in half to get the score of 50. So that's how that's going to work. My 50 points will be dictated the same as always. I'll give a mark out of 15 points for story, 10 of those are for plot, and 10 for characters and voice acting, 20 for gameplay, which includes 10 for actual mechanics, and 10 for fun factor, 5 for innovation, 5 for visuals relative to the time period, and 5 for identity, which is what sets developers apart from others. Now, my 50 points might be a bit more forgiving since it's not working with exact hard numbers, but if you shitty shit in the bed too often, that will negatively impact your developer as a whole, so bear that in mind. Once these results are in, we'll tally everything up and give a mark out of 100, and that's that. I also thought since developers have massive changes sometimes, I'd split this into all-time and modern, which will be strictly 21st century, because while some developers are smaller, or were smaller and made worse games in the 80s and 90s, in the 21st century they have evolved and deserve credit for doing that. For example, Naughty Dog is probably really high on people's list for best developer, but most people assume Crash Bandicoot was their first game. No, they had 10 years of shite as a small team before they got to that point, but they deserve credit for their modern stuff nonetheless. And it's a little bit unfair to take some of those older ones and their Metacritic scores and how badly they did and account them in with The Last of Us and Uncharted and that kind of stuff. So I just thought that would be fair to like split those up and really look at either modern or all-time developers. All that fun stuff out of the way, let's discuss how Square Enix stacks up to a world of Blizzards, Valves, and Nintendos. Square Enix was formed in 2003 after publishers Square and Enix merged. Taking games from Enix alone, we have 95 games. Square sported a cool 142, and post-merger, they created 272 games to date. And all that combined is 509 games, which, no. I am not making that many goddamn searches on Metacritic. So I found this handy-dandy thing on the Metacritic page called Square Enix's average career score, which gave the studio a 74 average, and I had to personally average the user scores to reach a final verdict of 72 there. While a lot of smaller games had no reviews, it gave as good a representation as we can get, except for one thing. It only gives us reviews after the merger, after 2003. So early Tomb Raider games and massive hits like Final Fantasy VII weren't included. So I went around and looked at a decent sample of older games that people loved before the merger, and some that people didn't like as much, some of which had Metacritic scores, and some of which I just averaged the scores that popped onto Google's homepage, and I tried my absolute hardest to get as exact as I could. Highlights here were games like Final Fantasy VII with a 92 on Metacritic, Chrono Trigger with also a 92, and Final Fantasy VI with a 91, among a bunch of others. Lowlights included Ultimate Saga with a 45 and Dirge of Cerberus with a 57. I averaged these out with about 30 positive games and 30 negative games, and I got a very respectable 79 with a user score a little lower than 75. Adding that to our original scores, and we get a grand total of 76.5 for our critic score and 73.5 for our user score, which averages out to 75 out of 100. So our 50 points in this category, we achieve a score of 37.5 out of 50. Okay, I explained that whole thing in like 2 minutes, but that took me hours and hours and hours to individually search up so many games. 509 games in 30 years. That's actually a bad thing, because, okay, look, 37.5 out of 50 might seem like an unimpressive number considering Square Enix has delivered classics like Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts, and the Deus Ex games, but reasons behind their less than incredible average can be tracked down to two things: inconsistency and dilution. Inconsistency can be found in even their best known franchises. There have been a lot of not too well received Final Fantasy games, and a heap of bad Tomb Raider games in the middle of the franchise's life, and that really hurts things overall. But I think the biggest perpetrator is dilution, which means they simply put out way too many games. Remember the figure that I just mentioned a little while ago, 509 games in a little over 30 years? That is an average of 17 games a year. Recently, in the past 13.5 years since they became Square Enix, they've upped that number to 20 a year, which is a game every 18 days. There's bound to be mountains and mountains of trash that come out of that, no matter how many subsidiaries you have. Some of these subsidiaries might focus on making a few games and making them really good quality, like Crystal Dynamics. But on the whole, Square Enix is essentially a factory, churning out hundreds of games, and that really hurts its overall consistency when it comes to releasing those games. Still, its heavy hitters and hidden gems give it a decent score of 37.5, which is nothing to scoff at. Let's see if I'm a little more generous than the rest of the world. Since I can't give my take on every single game developed by this company, I'm going to stick to just a few of the heavy hitters. For JRPG, or mostly JRPG game, we're going to be taking the big name in Final Fantasy. I could have potentially picked some like Kingdom Hearts here, but Final Fantasy is a bit more popular and has a more varied array of games in terms of how they were received. But I also can't for the life of me understand how many Kingdom Hearts games there are with all of their 1.5s and 2.8s and remixes, so I'll just pass on that. In terms of first-person shooting, I'll take Deus Ex, and finally for our action-adventure, we'll take the Tomb Raider games. These game franchises have both been amazing and absolute trash in the past, so let's take a look at how they stack up in each category. Story is up first, worth 15 points, and let's first delve into Final Fantasy. And from what I know and the small amount of what I've played, I can tell the story is a pretty big selling point here. True to the title, there is a lot of fantastical stuff here, cool lore, princes and quests, and all those things you'd expect in a fantasy-like game, but the best part of the story lies in its characters. It helps that you personally work on improving those characters' skill sets and HP, and they gain a sense of attachment to you like that. And personally, I thought the recent Final Fantasy game and its plots were almost entirely carried by those characters. They are really important. Final Fantasy is no slouch in the story department, and although some iterations are a little bit worse than others, most complaints towards certain games revolve around bad combat and game system, not story in general. And on the whole, they all hold up pretty well, although the first entry didn't really have a whole lot to boast here. Deus Ex is probably the most consistent out of the three series here, and the newest game, Mankind Divided, was a game that was personally number 1 on my most anticipated list for a long time before it came out. And I have to say, story-wise, that game was kinda subpar. Okay, maybe not subpar, but it was less than what I was expecting, which maybe is just the hype talking. I liked the characters well enough, and some of the cool espionage stuff was great, not to mention the world was amazing and one of the best aspects of the game, with the struggle between augmented people and certain terrorist acts clashing with humans, and all the cool social commentary and parallels found here, but some parts just fell flat and it ended really abruptly. Plus, although voice acting was pretty good, it did not match it with the characters' lips at all, which really broke the immersion. Still, the games in general, and even the one that I just went into detail about, have really good stories with a creative world, and they address real problems. I enjoy the things that these games try to tackle. Finally, we have Tomb Raider, and this probably has the most entries that just fall flat. For example, Angel of Darkness took a turn in tone that just didn't work and made you roll your eyes pretty often. The newer games have better stories, but I commend them more for gameplay and set pieces than the actual story. Maybe I've been spoiled by Uncharted when it comes to action-adventure games and their storytelling aspects, but nonetheless, it's not insanely impressive here. In terms of the two subsections of the story element, I'd probably give Square Enix as a whole a 7.5 out of 10 for their plots. A lot of them are really cool and interesting, but some of them are a little drab and uninteresting. They're not always consistent, and some games that I didn't directly mention also have some pretty uninspired stories, so while I wouldn't go as far to say they're bad, they're not absolutely incredible in this department. Character-wise, however, with the diversity alone in the Final Fantasy titles and the new characters every single time, plus interesting protagonists in Tomb Raider and Deus Ex, because I actually enjoy Adam Jensen and his badassery, I think Square earns a 5 out of 5 here, both for these games and a few others on the side that have also had some pretty interesting and unique characters and good voice acting overall. That gives it a total of 12.5 out of 15 for story, which, for a company producing as many games as it is a pretty respectable score. Gameplay is next, and first let's talk about the actual mechanics of the game. Final Fantasy has classically been turn-based, although a couple of different combat mechanics have been littered throughout the series here and there, including 15's action RPG-oriented fighting. This series is a flagship for turn-based combat, and when it made the move past those systems, it honestly did so pretty well. 15's combat is really fun, and while it's not OG Final Fantasy, which some people might not like, that doesn't really mean that the combat is bad. Still, there's a rocky road here, with some games having really questionable choices and others having absolute borefest campaigns until like the 20-hour mark, looking at you Final Fantasy 13, and some even giving you the ability to essentially cheat by letting your characters hit each other to improve their stats, making them really easily exploitable. As fun and intuitive as the combat can be here, it can also be downright silly sometimes. Deus Ex is again a little more consistent here, which may be because it has a few less titles than the others, but it still deserves props for that. Shooting is fun and has improved with every single entry, with the last one being crazy fun and also gives you an awesome power set as an augmented human that you can upgrade and improve as you go along. It's really enjoyable gameplay with great powers, and now it has a great sense of openness and the ability to tackle situations however you want, and that's just great. It's pseudo-open world that gives you a lot of power and balances all your abilities really well. Tomb Raider, while also having some definite low points, has seen some pretty great combat in the past, and I absolutely adore the combat in the rebooted game. It is the one thing that I think it has a leg up on its competitor Uncharted, at least in terms of actual gunplay. Uncharted is very simplistic with it, but Tomb Raider has more creation and upgrading and variety in weapons and all that. Overall, the combat here is pretty good, and the traversal, while not groundbreaking, is also solid. Now again, these games are not perfect here. I think a lot of game mechanics really work. We didn't even mention stuff like Kingdom Hearts' gameplay and how fun that is, and countless other games, and although there are definite negatives here and there, really here I think that the good outweighs most of the bad, but obviously the bad has to have some impact, so I decided on a 9 out of 10 here. In terms of fun factor, going back to Final Fantasy, it's pretty high here. While I personally am not a turn-based fan, nor a fan of grinding, except in Destiny. I don't know why, but that always got me grinding, even though deep down I wasn't even sure if I liked the game as a whole. But still, I can see the appeal of some of the turn-based gameplay. These games retain attention for hundreds of hours for a reason. Deus Ex is also really fun, and all the cool abilities are not overdone, but exist just enough to make you feel great when playing them. It is a really fun series. Tomb Raider also, like I said, has an awesome feel to the guns, and I love the variety. The speed of the gameplay is also perfect in my opinion, and some moments are like adrenaline shots, and it's all pretty entertaining. I won't quite put all these games as the same level as GTA, however, which I gave a 10 out of 10 here in a previous video, so I'll give it a small downgrade to a 9.5 out of 10 here, which gives it an 18.5 out of 20 in this whole category, which is actually really impressive. Innovation wise, I have to commend the Final Fantasy series for always changing things up. It doesn't always work all the time, but it is a good thing to see in a world where games like Call of Duty and Assassin's Creed can get away with making pretty much the exact same game over and over. Deus Ex has a great setting with a really good message, and Tomb Raider is not incredibly original in terms of the newer games, but originally it was a pioneer in both the action-adventure games and games with female leads. At the time, also, that T-Rex scene was the pinnacle of gaming. While not everything is godlike in this category, Square Enix does at least try to shake things up on occasion, especially with the Final Fantasy series, and it earns a pretty good 4 out of 5 in this category. I won't talk all too much on visuals, but in general, Square Enix produces some good looking games, which may not be as incredible as some games I've seen out there, but they're not bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's really hard with such a diverse gaming library, but overall I think I can give it a 4 out of 5 here. And finally, identity. A while ago, Square Enix made games that were very native to their brand, and you knew that game was by them. Nowadays, their only major staple that screams Square Enix is Final Fantasy. Even the Tomb Raider games, which are amazing, make you think Crystal Dynamics, not Square. Still, a lot of games in the past have a charm that the studio brings, and not all their properties have completely succumbed to dilution. but unfortunately not a whole ton really stand out amongst the crowd anymore. Even Final Fantasy's new iterations can't really be called the best RPGs out there. Deus Ex is in a pretty crowded genre, with not an insane amount of stuff to set it apart, and Tomb Raider is now overshadowed by Nathan Drake. Still, they're not uninspired, and the past games had a lot of identity and personality, so I'm willing to give them a 3 out of 5 here. All of that tallied up gives us a total of 42 out of 50 from me, and that means combined with our critic and user scores, we get a grand total of 49.5 out of 100. Now, that's for all time, and when you include Square and Enix when they were separate as well. In terms of the 21st century, I went back and redid my own grading and also turned the Metacritic scores back to the career averages, since that covers any semi-popular game from the developer since post-2003. Anyways, I got a grand total of 76 out of 100 for their modern stuff. Now, before you ask why such an iconic studio got such a bad rating, let me just say a near 80 out of 100 is not bad for a studio, especially one that has churned over 500 games in the past 30 years. Square Enix has some outstanding titles that really do realistically put it in a lot of people's top 10 developers, but the dilution really knocked them down a few pegs. In terms of best developers, a better focus is essential if you want to make consistently good games and earn great reputations, and Square Enix has kind of lost that, especially recently. Square, when it was on its own for the first few years, had an average of 5 games a year, and upon joining up with Enix, that number shot up to 4 times as much. 79.5 is still really great, but we'll see if it can hold up to developers that take more time on their games in order to improve their quality. It really will be a question of quantity and quality. But in the end, what all this really means is that I'm still super freaking pumped for the Marvel stuff that they're doing in the future. Let's hope that's more of a Rise of the Tomb Raider deal and less of an Ultimate Saga kind of thing. Until next time everyone, this has been AAA, signing off.